Now, I know no one has cared about legal code since Better Call Saul ended, but the story of how Rome's first written law code came to be is actually quite dramatic as well. So, let's go over that story, and then take a little look at what was written. Throughout the 8th and 6th century BC, as the Roman kingdom developed as a political entity, the laws were largely just a bunch of informal, non-officially written rules, and were mostly known by the aristocracy and priests, aka the patrician class. This style of non-codified laws continued into the early 5th century when the Roman Republic was formed. And as you can imagine, the laws not being formally codified in some kind of public writing and only known to the aristocracy tended to create some sketchy situations, tyranny and power abuse as one might say. So, as the story goes, in 462 BC, a plebeian tribune named Gaius Terentilius Harsa proposed a law to the Senate, Lex Terentilia, the Terrellian Law. This would have required the creation of a 5-man commission to write and codify the powers and authority of the consuls officially, instead of their undefined near-absolute power. The Senate did not like this, and managed to stop any debate and decision on it for nearly a decade. Eventually, the Lex Terentilia was dropped entirely, and instead the plebeian tribunes asked for a creation of a 10-man commission to draft and codify formal laws for both the patrician and plebeian classes. Supposedly, some envoys were sent to study the Sullian constitution in Athens, and afterwards the 10-man commission, or better known as the decemvirate, was then appointed, and the consulship and plebeian tribuneships were suspended for the time being, and authority was put into the hands of the decemvirate. Of the 10 men appointed, it included the consuls that were supposed to serve for the next year, and the only one I'll mention is Appius Claudius, the leading man in the group, and the most dramatic character in the story, as we'll soon see. The decemvirate wrote 10 bronze tablets of codified laws throughout the year, but it was decided at least a few more tablets were needed, so the decemvirate was extended into the next year, and this time they were elected. But allegedly, Appius Claudius rigged it for himself and men loyal to him. This new decemvirate was tyrannical and abused its power, but once the final 2 tablets were made, it should have meant regular elections for the consuls and tribunes would have happened on schedule for that year. But they didn't, and both the Senate and people were pissed. So much so that when the Senate was called, almost no one attended, and when Rome needed to raise armies to keep enemy tribes at bay, people only enlisted out of fear. The decemvirate would come to a dramatic end when Appius, trying to get with an already engaged woman named Virginia, the daughter of a Roman centurion, but after Virginia refused Appius' attempts to get with her, he threw a little bitch fit and created an elaborate scheme. He had one of his associates claim Virginia was actually the daughter of one of his slaves, which would make her legally a slave, and he would then try taking her away, but she would cause such a commotion that a crowd would form, and due to the respect her father and fiancé had, would demand she be brought to a trial. But the only major legal body was the decemvirate, led by Appius himself. Virginia's father was summoned from his military camp and went to her sham trial in an attempt to defend her, along with crowds of supporters. Unsurprisingly, Appius ruled in favor of the slave claim, and in a final response to save his daughter's dignity, Virginia's father stabbed her to death in a sort of deranged mercy killing. Appius then ordered the arrest of him and claimed he was involved in a sedition plot, but the crowds protected him and would force Appius to flee for his own safety. Afterwards, when Virginia's father quickly returned to his military camp, and they marched on to Rome and took control of the Aventine Hill, and soon after military units began revolting. Eventually the Senate met and the decemvirate was dissolved. The positions of old consuls and tribunes were reinstated, the military and civilian crowds eventually calmed down, and members of the decemvirate were arrested, including Appius. Virginia's father was put in charge of persecuting Appius, but he hung himself in prison before his trial. The rest of the decemvirate were either executed or went into exile. And finally, the 12 tablets were publicly put on display for the Roman public in the Forum in around 449 BC. These tablets were instrumental to future generations, to the point Roman children were even taught to memorize them. Now, I will have to give a little citation. It's almost certain that the dramatic events of Appius Claudius and other decemvirate shenanigans did not happen the way described previously, at least not exactly. While a law code was now officially written, it is not 100% clear what parts of the story are fully accurate and which parts were later dramatized retellings, since no contemporary sources from the era survived, so I just used good old Livy's exciting version. And the 12 tablets themselves have tragically not survived. What we have are fragments of stuff mentioned by Roman writers that referenced it and stuff that can be reasonably inferred from that. So what we have is various different reconstruction attempts at what the tables more or less said. The exact placements of different laws vary from historian, but for this video, we'll just be using the version created by historians Alan Chester Johnson, Paul Robinson Coleman Norton, and Frank Cardborn. Anyways, now let's actually get into what some of these laws said. I won't be mentioning every single one because many are very boring and technical, but let's see the interesting ones. Table 1 is about preliminary court stuff, and is mostly boring legal babble about how plaintiffs and defendants are supposed to behave. Rule 1 says the defendant must attend court if summoned, and also says a witness can stand in place of the defendant. Rule 2 says if the defendant tries avoiding court, then the plaintiff can have them forcibly taken to court. Rule 3 says if a defendant is sick and unable to travel, the plaintiff needs to provide transportation. Rule 8 says if one party does not appear in court before noon, then the magistrate will decide the case in favor of whoever is present. Table 2 is just more boring stuff on how trials are conducted. Rule 1 says, for property-related cases, each party will deposit a sum of money, and the losing party forfeits this sum to the state. For property worth 1,000 asses or more, the deposit should be 500 asses. For cases of a free person accused of being a slave, the deposit is only 50 asses. By the way, an ass in this case refers to a big copper bar as currency. In later centuries, they'd be coins. Rule 2 says, in case of serious illness, the court date can be delayed. Rule 3 says, if someone needs more evidence in a case, they're allowed to go to the house of a witness every third day to try and call them. Table 3 is about punishment for debt. And the entire table is basically just details for how creditors are supposed to proceed with debt punishment. Like once guilty, the defendant is given 30 days to repay the debt. If not, the creditor can functionally enslave them in a form of contract called a nexum. The creditor could potentially make the debtor work to pay off their debt or kill them. Death was probably not a common thing ever for this, but the very option for it is a bit intense. Like, imagine owing your credit card company a bunch of money and they come to your house and take you to trial, then afterwards they just chop your head off. These debt slave contracts would eventually be abolished in the 4th century BC. I will say details about these debt contracts are disputed by some historians, but whatever. Table 4 is about the rights a father had over his family, and there's 2 laws I think are the most wacky. Rule 1 says a severely deformed baby should be killed, so no Ricky Berwick allowed apparently. Rule 2 says a father can sell his sons into slavery, so I like to imagine Roman parents using this as a threat. Well, little Lucius, if you don't finish your greens, I'm selling you to the vineyards. Table 5 is about inheritance and guardianship. There's nothing that interesting here, but the first rule does say that adult women will always be under the guardianship of her father or husband, regardless of age. So anyways, Rule 7 says if a man is considered insane, then authority over him and his property goes to his male agates, basically his sons or closest male relatives. Table 6 is about ownership and property, and once again, mostly boring stuff. Rule 1 says verbal agreements are legally binding. So, no idea how you prove that in court, but okay, sure. Rule 5 says, in the cases of usus marriage, which was basically a form of marriage without any proper ceremony, and instead was if a man and woman lived together for a year, they'd be married. However, this rule said if a woman didn't want to be married and therefore under the guardianship of a man, she was allowed to leave the household for 3 nights a year, which makes the marriage unofficial since the year wasn't completed. Rule 8 says that stolen timber used in buildings or vineyards cannot be removed, and instead the plaintiff must take the defendant to court for double the amount of damages. Table 7 is just about property rules, and is basically the ancient equivalent to zoning laws, and I know how much everyone loves those, so I won't mention much. Except for Rule 10 that says that fruit that falls from your tree onto someone else's property is still your fruit. I just think it's funny how specific it is. Table 8 is about punishments for stuff, so exciting stuff here. Rule 1 says anyone that causes harm or disgrace by singing or composing a song can be put to death. So imagine modern defamation cases having the death penalty. Rule 2 says anyone that causes harm to someone's limb can be punished with an equal injury, or agrees to pay some kind of compensation. Rule 3 says if you seriously harm or bruise a freeman, aka a freed slave but not a full citizen, then the punishment is a penalty of 300 asses, or 150 asses if it was a slave. Rule 9 says that an adult caught stealing someone's crops at night shall be put to death. Rule 10 says that anyone who intentionally burns down a building or a grain supply next to a house shall be burned to death as punishment. Rule 12 says if you kill a thief at night, it's lawful. Rule 13 says you can only kill a thief during the day in self-defense. Rule 23 says anyone convicted of perjury will be killed by being thrown off the Tarpeian Rock, so death by fall damage. Rule 26 says no one shall hold meetings at night, so no funny business, ooh. Table 9 is about public law and more court shenanigans, so I won't say much. But Rule 3 says the punishment for judges taking bribes is death, so the Romans took their courts very seriously. Table 10 is about funeral-related laws. Rule 1 says no one is to be buried or cremated within the city, presumably for sanitary and safety reasons. Rule 4 says women are not allowed to make a dramatic display at funerals, so no crying so loudly, you stupid bitch. Rule 8 says no gold is allowed to be buried or cremated with the dead, except for gold dental work. Table 11 is just random supplementary laws, and the only notable one is Rule 1, the banning of intermarriages between the patrician and plebeian classes. That's gonna go over about as well as you'd expect. And finally, Table 12, which is just more supplementary laws about punishment, none of which are interesting. I don't know, Rule 4 says it's forbidden to use something for sacred religious purposes if the ownership of the thing is disputed. Otherwise, a punishment of double the value will be paid. And after that, there's a handful of unplaced fragments that are not known how they fit in. How the original 12 Tables tablets were lost to history is uncertain, but the most common theory is they were destroyed by the Gauls in their sack of Rome in the early 4th century BC. Because of this, some laws' authenticity in modern reconstructions are disputed, and some real ones were later appealed, modified, or went unenforced as the centuries went on. But regardless, the 12 Tables, for a time, did form the basis of Roman law code for centuries, and were later big inspirations for later Roman law codes, like the Code of Justinian in the 6th century AD, and even some US founding fathers took inspiration from the 12 Tables in Roman law. So one can easily say the 12 Tables were one of the most important legal codes in Western history, and with that, I'm back to being inactive for a month, lol.